Hey, well, welcome back, and we trust you enjoyed your lunch. The food here has been outstanding, and I really want to commend Jenny and Terry and Greg and those who have worked to select a really fun and yet nutritious and very, very good menu for you folks. And of course, if there's any hotel staff under the sound of my voice, we appreciate your hard work in executing on the plan here. I will tell you, yes, somebody wanted to give some appreciation. Let's make room for a little love, of course. Did anybody catch the It Takes Two music that we left for lunch with? A few of you did. Good job there, Stephen and Anibon and CII and CURT. There's the two that it's going to take. More on that a little later afternoon. Well, we are on the final stretch, and we're glad that you're still here with us. We understand there's quite a delegation in the lunchroom still. We understand that. But this is the final home stretch, and it is equally compelling and informative and interesting as anything that you've heard heretofore. So with that, I would like to direct your attention to the screens.
How can the industry overcome barriers to adopting, adapting, and embracing a smart data-centric integration framework? How can data sharing support a collaborative approach to developing, executing, turning over, operating, and maintaining capital projects? In this session, you will learn how a smart data-centric collaborative approach can establish a tightly knit supply chain and minimize the risk of transferring flawed information during the many handoffs in every project. Here to present, please welcome Robert Light and Mike Carancho.
Good afternoon. All right, that's quite the introduction. Let's get started. There's a few words appearing on the slides before me. By show of hands, how many are familiar with some of the terms that are cropping up here? Artificial intelligence, automation, digital twin, right? What do all these have in common? The audience participation part, right? You got to wait for the people to... Data, right? They all involve data. And this is really the key. Every project requires data from the beginning to end and beyond. Every stakeholder needs data to really drive their decision making. All those buzzwords have been around for a while now. So why are so many of our project teams still working in a non-data-centric environment? So I'm here to share some of the good news and some of the bad news that we came through in our research. Good news, we found and discovered a lot of the barriers that are actually causing some of these delays. The bad news is we can't overcome them for you. Right? You have to step in and take part of the process, but we're here to help. We're going to give you some resources to help you on that journey. The graphic behind me shows some of the less than stellar statistics from our project life cycles. I'll give you a moment to take that in. There's a lot there. I'm going to highlight on the top right corner, the red number, poor data usage. Your company probably already captures a ton of data. How much are you spending just to capture all that data that you're collecting? How much of it are you actually using? Is it partially or even fully leveraged, or is it something that's sitting there and gathering dust, so to speak? Adopting a more data-centric approach isn't going to fix these overnight, but it's going to start. It's going to put you a step in the right direction. So in just a few moments, I'm going to walk you through some of the barriers that companies face while trying to become more data-centric. Once these barriers are overcome, and you've adopted a more data-centric approach, these stats just keep getting better and better. So the question I'm going to pose to you, do you want your stats to get better? Do you want to know where your company stands? You're going to hear about a tool we created, a resource that we're going to give you today, backed by our industry research, that helps companies track their own data-centric maturity. So start thinking about it now. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being that 100-year-old analog Model T, great car for its time, but not new and pushing the limits. Or are you a 5? Are you Tesla? Are you processing something like 1 billion pixels a minute looking at some of these automated approaches. Where does your company fit in now? And more importantly, where do you want your company to be in 5 years? Lastly, we're going to prove that keeping tabs on your company's data-centric maturity not only provides incredible insights, but allows for increased transparency and growth. We went to the largest museum in the world, talk about their project barriers, their data maturity, and how keeping and tracking these concepts promoted successful projects and improved stats. But first, let me introduce some of those barriers mentioned. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of our research process, how we got here and the rigor we put in place, how we understood and prioritized the needs around data-centric approaches, and then how to support adoption specific to our construction industry. So to start, we wanted to go and get a comprehensive understanding of the barriers. We dug through lots and lots of literature, lots of different resources, lots of papers, came up with a long list, about 35 potential barriers related to technology adoption, things from specifics to modeling to broader just technology adoption and construction. We got together with our team of experts from the research team, and we grouped and understood and sorted those down to 22 that were more specific and more appropriate to understanding smart solutions using data. Those fell into 5 overarching categories: people, process, information, financial resources, and risk. We used this list of barriers to develop a survey. That survey went out to the CII member companies. It also went out to some targeted communities that specialize in technology adoption and data usage for our industry. When we came back looking at the importance, those barriers were ranked. As you can kind of get a sense, there's some general agreement. All of them are relevant. They're all pertinent barriers that have some importance. But some are more important than others. Highlighting a few of the top barriers here: interoperability, cost, organizational resistance to change. Probably not shocking things that come up. But you'll notice they're not all in one category. It's not all technology. It's not all information. It's not all people. It spans multiple categories, and this is one of the reasons this is tough. After digging into the importance, we want to make sure we had a proper assessment of which of these are actually the most difficult to overcome. Again, you're looking at the data, all of them are somewhat difficult to overcome. None of these are easy. That's why they're barriers for our industry. But again, we see a few that emerge as the top barriers. Some of them are consistent, things like interoperability. And we see some new ones arise, working with smaller firms that may not have the capacity to take on some of these technologies themselves. Other things like cybersecurity emerge as well. So to help address the challenges we found from these barriers, we developed a tool, an assessment tool. We went through and dug through more than 20 tools related to adoption, found some areas where we needed to complement not just addressing the barriers, but other aspects from project needs or organizational technology needs, to ensure we had a comprehensive approach that we could put in one resource. The resulting resource has parallel assessments. It looks at the organizational approach to data for your firm, as well as for projects, because they're slightly different contexts. So a specific project brings together teams that may need to develop systematic processes, mapping software and data needs, defining those discipline processes for how data is going to be shared on a more regular basis and support the needs of the project. When we created this, the resulting assessment tool addresses 4 criteria we laid out at the beginning to make sure it was effective. The first, the ability to help navigate all those barriers. We identified 22 barriers. We wanted to make sure our tool helped address them. Second, it supports and is really structured to address both those challenges at the project and the organizational levels. Third, we wanted to create objective indicators. This does 2 things for you. So if you were to give it to different people, we should come away with a very similar rating across those people, because they're objective, they're very clearly defined when you give the score. Second thing that does for you is it helps you to set targets. So if we're at a 2 today and we want to get to 4, it tells us what a 4 looks like. We have information to inform where we want to get to, what does that state look like in the future, so we can create a plan. The last, our 4th criteria, was it should be easy to use. We're trying to support data-centric approaches. We want to make it something that's very easy for people to get, use, extract data from, and look at analytics. So it's put into Excel. Be able to download it here. I'll show you at the end of the presentation how to do that. But you can then extract information across projects. You can look at different timelines across your organization. And to better illustrate the value of these things, I'm actually going to turn it over to our colleague remotely. Michael Crancho unfortunately couldn't join us, but he sent some information about Smithsonian's journey.
Hello, I'm going to talk to you about the Smithsonian Institution case study, which centered around the National Air and Space Museum renovation. Before I get into the details of the case study, I'd just like to give you some background about the Smithsonian so that you can understand kind of our breadth and depth and be able to make a comparison with your organization. So a lot of people think that the Smithsonian is just in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. and is maybe 3 or 4 museums, the Air and Space, Natural History, the new African American Museum, but actually we're 19 museums and 9 research facilities, and you can kind of see the globe there. We've got facilities around the nation and internationally with telescopes on Mauna Kea, an extensive research facility down in the Isthmus of Panama. And there you can see some of the statistics about how many square feet we've got, how many employees and volunteers and visitors. And one unique thing about the Smithsonian is the fact that we are open 364 days to the public, closed only on Christmas Day. So let's get into the details of the case study. So it's centered around the National Air and Space Museum. This was our most ambitious data-centric project to date. We really kind of called it the pilot, but it's such a long project that other projects have gone through their complete life cycle while we're still in construction on this project. So you can see the timeline of our data-centric or BIM initiative, Building Information Modeling. So it really began in 2013 where we had a consultant help us who was expert in this type of data-centric management, doing research. We hired a BIM technician. We developed use cases. So when we did our standards, they were informed by the use cases that we intended to use them for. So we knew exactly what we were going to use BIM and the data associated with BIM in our facilities management, in our design, and in our construction. The next year we published those standards and we identified the pilot projects. We also published Revit templates. These are actual Revit files that are set up with all of our standards so that our consultants don't have to start at a blank piece of paper or a blank file. And we continue to refine the standards. We publish new standards every October with the change of the federal government's fiscal year. And then in 2016, we published more documents with a construction specification, a model checker, A&E statement of work. And we have several documents that are all located on our what we call our AE Center website, and they're all open and available to the public. So if you're interested, just Google Smithsonian AE Center, and it should come up. Just some examples of our documents and our deliverables. We require existing conditions confirmations where we'd like to see 4D phasing. Many of the construction contractors are required to do that when they bid on one of our projects. We'd like to see the logic of the way that they're going to conduct the project. We require a record model at the completion of construction. And a big part of our data-centric initiative was really about asset management and how we manage assets going in and out of the building during construction. And we have a unique workflow for how we do that. So we start off right away with immersive design. This is actually reviews of the Air and Space project. So on the right there, you can see we utilize software, a gaming engine software, and a virtual reality headset, and we can immerse our staff into the facility before it's designed. This was actually happened at 35% design. The person in the goggles there is the zone manager who's going to be managing that building once it's completed construction, and he's being curated through the mechanical space that he's going to be in charge of. He's looking at the equipment. Great takeaway. At 35% design, we put the technicians in there, and we instantly got feedback for rotating the boilers around 180 degrees to be able to get access. And then, of course, during construction, you can see there that gaming engine software translated right through to construction, and you can see one of the construction contractors looking at the model, looking at what was installed, tracking issues, those types of things. And then record of existing conditions using a camera in photogrammetry and having a 3D dollhouse of the existing building. And then here you see the example of our facility asset spreadsheet. We looked at COBE, but COBE was really too much for us, so this is a custom, bespoke, smart spreadsheet that goes with the workflow of how we manage our assets. And here you see the tagging of the assets, which is the culmination of the process where something's been installed. It has gone and been inserted into our computer-assisted facilities maintenance software, and it generates the equipment tag. The equipment tag gets put on, and now we can start building our PMs. And we do this for every 10 assets. Once 10 assets are installed, it triggers the workflow to print out those sheets, and the assets get tagged. It's not something that happens at the end of the project. So you can see here, this project's going to complete in 2024, and the first assets were installed and tagged in 2019, and that's a continuous process. So now we're going to get into the maturity matrix model, so you understand kind of where we are and where we are in our maturity, so you understand these scores. And so this is a snapshot of both the organization maturity and the project maturity. And the reason why we have this slide here is to kind of show how the project maturity scores coincide with the organization maturity scores. So as our organization matured in its data-centric workflows, the projects that were executed by the organization also matured. And you can see there, kind of aspirationally, on the organizational maturity, we started off at a very low level of 19%, but we aspired to a 53%. Then the following assessment, we currently assessed ourselves at 42%, and then of course aspired to 74. But if you look at the 53 and 42, they're fairly closely matched. So we were on track to meeting our aspirations with regards to our organizational maturity. And the same thing with the projects. You can see how they progressed as well. We'll get into some details of some of those scores. So these spider diagrams really kind of show you the individual sections of the maturity model and how we both scored ourselves from where we actually were to where we would like to be, and from the standpoint of the categories of strategy, collaborative process, data, infrastructure, people, and use case capabilities. And also kind of gives you an indication of where we wanted to stress our performance, right? Whether it be people, whether it be strategy. So you can see there on the right in 2020, strategy is an area that we emphasized, as well as data, and you can see that the actual scores follow the trend of that's where we had our highest levels of attainment and meeting our aspirations. So here's some detail about the three projects that we're talking about. These three projects are the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was a very early project. That was the first project that we actually even just included the terminology of building information modeling, or BIM. We had no published standards, and we didn't really have any aspirations. We just had heard that BIM and data was good, but we had no idea of what we were going to do with it and how we were going to use it. The Dulles Collection Center, which is that middle project, is actually a precursor to the National Air and Space Museum renovation. We had to build a $50 million collection storage facility to store the collection that we needed to move out of the Air and Space Museum in order for us to do that project. The museum, the National Air and Space Museum, is 50% open, so we were only working on half a museum at the time, and so the collections had to go out on loan, or they came here, or to other storage facilities around the institution. But we had to build this one, and so this was critical path for the Air and Space renovation. It had to be planned, designed, constructed, and collections move in before we could turn over the mall building to the contractor. And it was done entirely in BIM with all of our published standards, but our very early published standards in that kind of midterm, right after they were published, because you can see that project is 2014. And then, of course, the Air and Space Museum project, which started at the very birth of our standards and continues to go on to the present day and is planned to be completed in 2024. So here you can see those project scores, and you can see how our planned and actual scores match with regards to our aspirations. So you can see on the African American history and culture, We had very low expectations and aspirations with a score of 11%, but in fact we actually attained more than what we were expecting with receiving a 12%. And you can see where we attained that was up there in the data use cases, right? So we were able to use more data than we had originally started off. And then for the Dulles Collection Center, you can see there, well, we didn't quite attain everything we wanted, and we learned a lot about why we didn't attain it, And so the maturity model allows you to be able to analyze your projects and your strategies and where you are aspiring and where you're not meeting your aspirations, and then, of course, what you need to do in order to be able to be successful in meeting your aspirations. And then once again with the Air and Space Museum, doing a little bit better there with only 2%, falling behind kind of what our aspirations are. So you can see there, we had a very high expectations for data use cases, but we're not quite attaining our full aspirations for that. However, on the process side, we're actually doing better than what we had planned to do. So the tool is just very good for being able to help your organization progress, understanding and defining what your future, what you would like your future to be, and the same with the projects, being able to then assess your projects as to where you want to be on a project, and then be able to measure it, because what gets measured gets managed. Now I'm going to turn you over to Keith, and he's really going to go into some detail on how to actually use the tool.
All right. So to clarify, Keith was unable to join us, so you're back to me. So as Michael described in his journey, this is not a once and done. This is an iterative process. You can jump in and start evaluating your process, your projects today. The first step is getting the right people in the room. Probably not always the easiest step, right? Whether it's specific to your organization and where your vision is, or it's specific to a target project. You need to get those people together first, understand where you are today. The tool then helps you drive process, identify what your current status is, but also helps you target where you want to be. And with those targets in place, you can identify the gaps, and you can put a plan together on how you want to get there. How do you want to achieve those targets? And you can craft your plan specific to those needs. And at the appropriate time, you reevaluate. And as necessary, you may need to adjust your plan, as you saw from the video. Not just for your organization, but across your varied projects. Each project may not need the same score. They have different needs, they have different requirements, and that ties to what kind of data you may need to collect in that scenario. But the tool makes that process well-defined, it gives it a structure, and it gives it transparency, and something that can help you reach consensus, whether or not that may not be the easiest thing, depending on the people you get in the room. That's the fun part. Stop worrying about what it is you're doing and focus on how do we get there. So once you get the right folks in the room, why don't we take a quick look at how the tool works and how easy it is to use. All right. So as you can see from the video, the tool is intended to be very easy to use, very intuitive, simple inputs. The key comes from getting the right people in the room to get that first assessment and determine what you want to do with your approach based on where you set your goals. The tool then lets you assess your projects, update for your organization, and see how your plan is progressing. Once you've started, you'll have a good idea where you are today and what you want to focus on to make that next step in your journey. So let's go back for a moment and talk about where your company stands. Now that you've seen the tool, now that you've seen Smithsonian's journey, how sure are you about your data-centric maturity? How mature is your organization? How mature are your projects? Are you a Model T or are you a Tesla? And which one are you going to be moving forward? So, as I mentioned earlier, you can start using the tool today. It's available by using the QR code that's shown on the screen. It doesn't even take you to a website, it just becomes a download of the files. Now you can pull it open and start looking at it yourself, or I might actually suggest turn around and share it with someone else in your organization to start the conversation. Right, reach out today, share it with them, and then when you get together, probably via Teams or Zoom, whatever your weapon of choice is, to get into a conversation about the maturity of your firm. So CII will also continue to house the tool, as you probably get the sense from the video. We're also working with CII to put out a webinar through the Information Management CBA. So we're trying to get that scheduled to be available this fall. I suggest come joining. We'll go into more detail on how to use the tool, a little more of the point and click. But you or someone from your organization can join and get engaged and start using it right away. That, I want to say a big thank you. As you may have guessed, this was not all me. There's a much broader team involved here. So I want to take a minute to acknowledge the diverse team, the folks that are highlighted in bold, put a lot of work actually also into the presentation, but unfortunately weren't able to join me today on stage. So make sure I get them an extra shout out for their efforts to craft this presentation. But it was through their time and their effort that the research and the tool that we created are available for you to use and take back to your organizations. So with that, I'm going to say I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you for your time.
Robert, and online, thank you, Michael. And by the way, we want to acknowledge our online attendees. As I mentioned before, we have a couple of 3 dozen of them, and they have been faithfully following the course of this event, albeit remote. And we want to acknowledge you and thank you for joining us, to those who are joining us virtually. And yes, we do have a couple of questions, and I'll give you one that I think that they'll go in sequential order, but let's see. In the tool, what does the, quote, total possible column actually mean?
So we've set the tool up to measure maturity. So that there is using a capability maturity baseline, each element has a maximum score of 5, and you're totaling that up to get a score. When we present the data, like Michael did for Smithsonian, it's set up as a percentage of 100. So it's adjusted into 100% capacity, so 100 is the highest you could get on one of the charts. But it's really about the maturity you have for each of the elements, the ability to plan out that maturity and advance your firm's approach.
Thank you for that. How did the differences in industry factors show up in your research?
We actually reached out across several different industry groups, so it was not specific to the building sector when we did this. The example in the case study from Smithsonian was a little more building-centric, but we had folks from the power sector, we had folks from the industrial sector, so we had some different groups that we did case studies with in addition to Smithsonian, and the testing of it was consistent, the value of it was consistent across those groups. And the ease of use was pretty consistent as well. Little variations in some of the targets and use cases that they were interested in, but very, very similar.
Can you share with us some of the industries that are at the top of the data-centric journey, and any idea how it has improved their bottom line?
That's a really tough one. I think there's an interesting challenge, as we are seeing across some of the presentations yesterday and today, of how do we quickly try to adapt to using more technology. The folks, I'm not going to say there's a specific industry that's been killing it, but I think the folks that have been doing very well do a balance of breadth of data as well as starting to work their way through the depth of the usage in small ways, and then once they master that, moving on to a next process, a next technology they want to put in place. So you have to think about, not just we're going to get all the data first, and then we're going to start looking at what do we do with the data to make sure it's right. You need to start doing that in small ways immediately. As Michael said in the presentation, they wait till, as soon as 10 assets, 10 pieces of equipment, air handlers, pumps, whatever it may be, as soon as they hit 10, that instigates the process of them going through and tying it into their asset management, even though they're 5 years from turnover in that case.
Thank you, Robert. How does the tool help you come up with a real, true, doable plan to succeed and to proceed?
So the tool helps in two ways. One, it provides transparency. I think that's one of the challenges we came across is a lot of people think they're doing different things on the technology and the data side, but they have a really hard time sort of pinning down where they are, where they're going. So it makes that consistent and transparent, that you can have a clean assessment of where you stand. And then using that objective approach to the levels of maturity, it becomes very concrete of what the pieces are you want to put in place, what the processes are you want to create, what requirements you need to define specific to your data needs, and at least give you a target where you need to go and what kind of help you may need to get there.
Great, thank you. Since we've been talking about the importance of people, one of the audience asks, if we're going to use the tool, who or what roles should be involved in planning the data-centric approach?
Yeah, and this is a challenging one. You want to make sure you bring together, obviously, the folks who are going to be familiar with the technology and the data needs. So you need to have that technical aspect informed in the conversation. You also need to make sure you have leadership. So you're going to have support and buy-in for the plan and tie into what's appropriate for your organization in terms of the way you want to use data, the vision of where you're going to go with that data, and then probably one or two other leaders in that mix to balance out how that ties into your operations or how it ties into capital procurement, so that all of this is considered when you're putting that plan together.
Great. You're doing great, by the way. He's batting 1,000, isn't he? This is eerily similar to PDRI, says one audience member. Was it modeled after this? Did you look at PDRI as you went through your journey?
We had discussions about PDRI. We did not specifically model it after PDRI. But we did have discussion about the value and the way in which that system works and how it's fairly intuitive once you've gone through that process and the rigor that comes along with it. So that ideal was tied in, right, providing rigor, providing a consistent process and the structure to an area where we sometimes don't have structure. So in that sense, we were aware of it and learned from it, but we didn't build directly from it.
Great. Another listener says, are there any recommended weight factors, and if they are easily changed, do you find team members changing them to get a better score?
So we did not recommend weight factors, partially because we did not find ourselves in a situation to do a more quantitative assessment of the value of each of those things. So we realized that some companies and organizations may have a benefit of some and others that they just, for some reason, aren't impractical to use. So we didn't want to default that. We put that in so it's something you have some flexibility to set for your organization. But we would suggest your organization determine how you want to weight it and then try and lock it so that others don't manipulate it later.
One of the listeners writes, what is the biggest benefit that the case study project saw from this data-centric approach? The greatest benefit of all of the many?
So specific to the resources we're putting out there, the benefit came from that clarity and that transparency of where they were and having that structure. And it was Michael's phrase, actually, when he was talking about what they had to put in place for the Air and Space Museum of disciplined collaboration. Right, so they had other projects where there was a little bit of vagueness to what the requirements were, what the goals were, and they found, I think at the end of the project, they were things they wanted that they didn't collect. And for part of that may have just been that they didn't ask for them properly. So they said, we need to make some disciplined approaches, structured process early, get this process moving. And I think that was kind of a key to their success in that scenario.
Great, thank you. Another listener sends a question. Of the 6 major areas you identified, which ones are the organizations struggling with the most, in your opinion?
That was tough. We definitely saw variation across organizations and where they had their difficulties. I think it does still tie back to the ability to properly define some of the data and information needs. And I think providing a little bit of structure to how to have that conversation, at least sets the stage for how do you do this consistently at the organizational level and what things to start asking for consistently across your projects.
Great, he's still batting 1,000. Here we go with another one. We've started some pilot projects to collect data, hand over to operations. How would this tool help us once we've already started our pilot projects?
So it's great to have pilots in place, and I think that's a wonderful initiative to start looking at handover, start looking at those requirements. Usually when we've interacted with some of the clientele that's asked for data, we find that at first they ask for all kinds of things, collect it, and then realize they can't use a lot of what they're requesting. Maybe for a number of reasons. So what we found is this helps with covering the array of elements, not just the specific data requirements, but how do you look at it for procurement? How do you look at it for the processes that need to be defined on our project? So it allows you to look at that holistic picture of how do we want to get to that end result, not just the one piece.
Another question, I enjoyed the case study presentation by the Smithsonian. Do you have any answers as to whether or not it was challenging for that team to complete or fill out the tool?
No, so in the process, we went through the tool with Smithsonian. We also actually independently went through it with the architecture and engineering team and with the contractors. And in all cases, first time they see it, it was probably less than an hour to take that pass through the first time. So even with really a lack of familiarity, it was a relatively simple process and not overly time intensive to get that first assessment. Again, putting the plan in place and defining the plan still is a little work beyond that, but it went pretty smoothly.
Great, thank you. Another one of our audience members writes, how correlated is improving a project's data maturity and improving project delivery, such as cost and schedule performance? How correlated is improving the data with improving the cost and schedule performance?
This is something we dug around with quite a bit at the beginning of the project and I'll be honest, it's really, really challenging. In some ways, if you step back and think about it, data's not really at the center of the process. It's something that's generated throughout the process. When we generate engineering designs or when we create procurement logs, we're creating the data. So it's sort of almost a lagging indicator of what happens in the process. So it didn't turn out in some way that we could get a quantitative link of data equals better project outcomes in a linear fashion. What we did find is when people were thoughtful about it, we could start to see them find targeted areas where they're wasting time that you could very simply automate processes and reduce a lot of waste and put your people back on what is it really that you're getting into. The statistic that came to my mind is yesterday when the folks were talking about the workforce from Paul Goodrum and Tim Taylor. They did that 37% time supervising, right? That just stood out to me, that we're putting too much of these tasks on people that pull them away from the value-adding aspect of their work. We want to use the data to reduce that and let them focus on what it is they do in that role.
Since we've been talking about the future and encouraged to anticipate it, what does next after next look like for this team? What does the future hold in 2.0?
I think the really intriguing opportunities, and there were some great presentations about the directions and some of the challenges we're facing, seeing some of the AI, seeing some of the robotics that we're going to need to adopt in some fashion to just complement our workforce shortages, just evolving those use cases and understanding what the data needs will be, how that's going to affect our design processes in the future. It's just going to be a whole revolution that's coming, but we're not quite there yet, but we're going to have to get there quickly.
Great, thank you. And finally, since the Smithsonian case study was presented virtually, this may be a question for Palmer and the production team. Would it be possible to post the case study slides in the app from the virtual presentation? We'll take that under advisement. I'm hearing that it could happen. We don't know if there's any roles.
I believe we can do that. We'll coordinate to make sure that's.
You'll work, Robert, with
Absolutely.
Greg on that and the team. Whoever asked a question, we'll get those posted for you if possible. Smithsonian may have some restrictions on it. We'll find out, and Robert will get back to us on that.
Absolutely.
Let's give it up again for Robert and Michael. Michael, if you're here, yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Michael, if you're still listening virtually, we thank you. That was a terrific case study, and thank you for joining us. Stephen.
Thank you, Greg. The next item on the agenda, is a panel presentation, really exciting panel presentation about renewable fuels, carbon capture, the market for carbon and how to manage that, other market activities and potential outcomes. We have a number of distinguished panelists, and they will come up now to explore different dimensions of this important topic. The moderator will introduce each panelist, but my job right now is to introduce your moderator, who is Bob Nussmeier. And Bob is the Vice President of Business Development for Strategic Clients and Partners at Kiewit's Energy Group. He's focused on clean fuels projects. He's been a real strong catalyst for connecting clean energy, hydrocarbon, renewable fuels companies, and petrochemical companies with Kiewit's professionals to help them do engineering and construction and build high-performing projects. He's been at Kiewit since 2011, and before that, he had an executive career at Baker Concrete, and he's also worked with BASF and Schofield. So please welcome Bob and the panel to the stage.
Thank you.
Stephen. Oh no, they're right there.
Good. We mic'd, you hear me? Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. I guess the last time Stephen was standing up here and introduced me was the CII annual conference. We can't decide whether it was 3 or 4 years ago, but it's good to see everybody. And now I remember the conference so well because my neck got sore because in this particular room, you're constantly doing this to make sure you don't, leave anybody out. But we're really honored to be able to chat with you. This is going to be a little unusual, meaning that for the most part, these specialists, experts, friends, and really smart people aren't really sure what I'm going to ask them. So we're going to watch them dance on their feet. We're going to watch them come from very different perspectives. The kind of the ground rules I want to share with you for the next hour is we're going to have complete disclosure. We're not going to BS you down a road of our own biased thinking. Each of these individuals have a very, very different perspective and role to play as it relates to reduction of carbon emissions in North America. And predominantly that's what we're talking about. Yes, from that solution of reducing substantially the carbon emissions, there'll be a lot of capital projects, as all you know. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the other influences that are going to ultimately affect the outcome for the next 2 decades, 1, and 2, it'll help all of us realize the solutions in front of us for the next 20, 25 years are very complex. They're very, what I want to say, requiring better collaboration of the leadership than we've ever had before, or otherwise a lot of these promises aren't going to happen. So a lot of this discussion is going to be based upon that. Likewise, I want to say that we've got a really good group. So I'm going to introduce your folks real quick that I've got, and I want to say thank you, gentlemen, and Kelsey for joining us and making the trip in. So our first distinguished guest is Nigel. Nigel is a consultant and a real heavy-duty carbon capture, carbon sequestration, carbon reduction expert. He consulted throughout the world for a lot of years and recently has joined Baker Hughes with the initiative of helping mold the way Baker Hughes is going to address decarbonization strategies. So great to have you here, Nigel.
Thanks.
Most of you know that I'm pretty politically smart, so the only way I'm going to get a raise is if I can get my boss on the panel. So I want to introduce you, Alistair Cullen. Was drafted from KBR when he got done with his training a year and a half or so ago. Joined Kiewit. He is our business line leader relative to the energy transition, particularly in the renewable fuels, renewable power arena. So, Alistair, thanks. Does anybody not know this man? All right, so I'm not going to say anything about Jim, but thank you for joining us. But everybody knows Jim.
You're welcome.
And then a distinguished gentleman that we were fortunate to bring in from Iowa, is Dan. And Dan, a lot of you people know a company called Renewable Energies, and he was CEO of that for many years, and now is currently CEO and president of an agribusiness that takes a lot of carbohydrates, sugars, proteins, and other things and turns it into specialty low carbon or zero carbon or net zero chemicals. So huge depth in the industry on the bio side that a lot of us are really kind of green. He understands how to make good beer, but he does a lot of other cool things with the bugs and the yeast and everything else. So it's great to have Dan here. Dan also has a unique collection, if you want to talk to him later, about historical homes in Bloomington, Indiana, as a hobby, and that's pretty cool. So he's got a bunch of those. So Dan, thank you much for joining us.
Thank you.
And does anybody not know Kelsey? So you know her as president of Continuum, and she's a huge servant leader in our industry, as we all know. And if she can ever, there's just no way Stephen Mulva will ever be able to pay her back on what she's done to make sure he looks good. But she's also a great consultant. And so we're glad to have her on the panel as well. And we needed somebody that was feisty, so we picked her.
Because you weren't enough.
Exactly. All right, so let's dive in to the questions that you all have initiated that we're going to try to give some interesting perspectives to. So question number one is, as we see dozens daily press releases by public and private corporations that state, here is our carbon reduction goal in 2025, 2050, whatever it is. We see these constantly. They're rolling out all the time. The question the audience has for you is, how much of this is fact and how much of this is fiction? And what does it really, really mean as you see the reality of these things settling down? So with that, I open it up to the panel.
Let me start then.
Go ahead, Nigel. Yep,
Thanks,
that'd be good.
everybody.
Let the consultant go.
So it needs to be a reality, of course, for us to avert the world from the worst effects of climate change. How we go about it, of course, is the main, how we implement technology quickly, effectively, efficiently, get costs down, of course, is really perhaps the ultimate question we should be asking ourselves, particularly I think for this audience. One, in order to meet the emission goals in 2070, 75% of the technologies that are needed to achieve that aren't mature today. And so how do we make sure that we can continually adopt new technology in plants that we're building today that are going to have a 20, 30, 40, 50-year lifespan? That's a big question. Being carbon capture ready with plot space and, of course, connections is a simple, easy thing to build in today. Really, perhaps should be the basis. But and give the option to implement, of course, in the future. But then what types of technologies, of course, it matters. And there are so many different technologies out there. So yeah, I would say we need to achieve it. We can achieve it, but we need to do things differently.
Dan, you think the promises are real?
Well, I think the intent is real. I think people are sincere, and they really want to do it. I think it's a huge problem. So if you start with the basic idea of what is lower carbon intensity world, and I think a lot of times this isn't understood, it's basically we're in a carbon world. There's a bunch of carbon in the ground. Historically, we pulled it out for energy and for things that occur in manufacturing, both of which, when we consume them, end up in emissions, and we end up with more carbon in the atmosphere than we want. So anything we can do that reduces the pulling out of the ground and more the reutilization of carbon that's in the atmosphere, the better off we're going to be based on what we think. So not every industry has a simple time doing that. Others are more ready to do it right now. You see a lot of folks trying to pay for somebody else to get it done, buying credits, trying to get a credible credit. It isn't just technology, it's also trust. So people have to believe that when they're doing an offset or they're paying for an offset, that it's real, that there's been integrity in the system, not just in the letter of the rule, but in the intent and the actions of the companies that are there. And as you start following that and you start thinking about the real challenges practically, if you just want to be able to verify, and you just want to be able to know, and then you think about politics and regulation, because politics gets expressed through regulation, and groups of people around the world all think about it differently, whether it's industrially efficient or not, I think it gets smaller and more local. So when we think about building, construction, processing facilities, and so forth, it's always been logistics, it's always been economies of scale, but those are now tempered by integrity in the system where you can verify locally, and the movement of things where the end price is not just cash, the end price is also calculated in your carbon emissions. So I think we're not going to have huge places anymore. I think they're going to be a lot more local. We're not going to be linear programming across continents to get stuff moved here or there. I think it's going to be a lot more in the same language, looking locally, building, verifying locally. And then there'll be some industries that are able to generate a lot of carbon benefit that others like maybe a Microsoft will pay for, but it won't be so direct because it's not generating the emissions in the same way. How we get to that set is a big question. But I think we're well on the way, and as a biofuels advocate, if you look at California today, I think about a third of the emissions benefits that are calculated right now are from biofuel being consumed in the area. That's a real answer. There are a lot of others that need to come.
Good. Alistair?
Yeah, I think, it's a transition that's happening, right? This isn't the first one. We went from wood to coal, coal to oil, oil to gas, and now we're here today. What's probably different this time around is all the transitions in the past to energy have always been additive. And we still burn as more coal today than we did 50 years ago. So the challenge this time is greater because it's to decarbonize. It's not just to add new fuels, it's to get rid of some of the fossil fuels today. And, countries and corporations and owners are moving at different speeds. Some are transitioning at slower speeds, some are transitioning at faster speeds, and some are completely transforming into new businesses where they've been in markets where they're producing or operating at big scale. And how do you change that to new technologies and create growth markets with margins? The business I'm looking at today, and a lot of the oil and gas companies are looking at today are, there's renewable fuels, biofuels, there's carbon capture, there's alternative fuels like hydrogen, there's chemical recycling, and they're all at different phases in development of technology and implementation and cost affordability. Probably the most mature one that we see in the markets that Kiewit looks at the moment are probably on renewable power, both wind and solar, and they've been great examples of how technology has evolved to get costs down and to scale up those projects successfully over the last 10 years, where they're now cost competitive and better than coal and cost competitive with gas going forward. So the hope and the question is how fast will the technologies evolve in those other market sectors to get to cost parity or cost advantage with or without subsidies over time. So.
Good.
I just wanted to build on that. I agree that the challenge is different because we're trying to get rid of something rather than just layering, but I think we're actually doing both. I think, we also are going to need to continue to meet growing demand globally, and then we're challenged with major weather events that continue to increase here, where we have things like the crazy ice storm and snowstorms in Texas last winter and not being able to meet the demand locally. Yeah. And so while we're reducing carbon, we're also needing to grow the energy sources overall.
Yeah. I've heard somebody refer to it as democratization of energy. You know, moving from, you know, a few resource holders, petrostates, to electrostates. You know, and having consumers now be producers themselves. So, I mean, it's definitely a different world, but of course, the system is completely different. The energy types, you know, perhaps actually quite similar. But yeah, so the electricity pathway, of course, is a big, huge growth area, much larger growth expectations than traditional.
Yeah, you're right with that. I mean, there needs to be a great electrification, right? To achieve this, there needs to be great electrification in developed economies and developing economies. And although it's not sexy, you know, to use a word, they're not fancy technologies, but there's a lot of transmission infrastructure that needs to get built up. It's hard. It's a lot of capital to be put in, but it's needed in order for electrification to be successful and to deal with more distributed generation as opposed to, you know, large centralized facilities, the way it works today.
I'll be a little bit of a contrarian. I'm going to go back to your first question. The intent is good. Talk is great. Listen to it. Where's the action? So, I mean, are we satisfying the shareholders of our company and making it look good? Because that was your real question, right? And the answer to that is yes, right? In a lot of ways. I just don't think we're where we need to be. There's available sources today to do exactly what everyone on this panel is talking about. Let's get going.
Do it.
Do it. Just do it. Nike said, right?
Yeah.
So I really believe that, you know, this is the kind of discussion that goes along, you know, the C-suites of our companies. And do they really translate that vision that everybody's talking about here, which is a great vision? We have to do it. It's an imperative. We talked about that yesterday. But can we really put it to action so that for me, every data center has a generator that's backing up to give me high reliability that's being fed off of renewable fuels, or perhaps blue or green hydrogen.
So given that and what you've already stated with Microsoft, for some of us in the audience that are just starting to travel the road of an equitable, environmental, sustainable governance policy, you got any recommendations of what we should be doing now as we go down that road?
I'll pass that one.
So I would say, you know, of course, you know, the lowest cost way to manage emissions today is through energy efficiency, right? And doing things more efficiently. Then we, of course, move into indeed, you know, the offsets, carbon offsets, Dan, you mentioned, and land-based use, change, reforestation, etc. Then, of course, we're starting to move into the more complex, more technological aspects, I would say, that are emerging. We call them the new frontiers of course, hydrogen and CCUS and geothermal. But again, these are technology types with fundamental core technologies that have been used in other ways. We're, of course, now just applying it for a different purpose to achieve a different result. So yeah, there is definitely a pathway for engagement. Certainly when in the last few years, so we released our Baker Hughes net zero strategy 2.5 years ago. And, you know, we're well on the way to achieve that. You've seen our sustainability reports, of course, and getting back to informing our shareholders how much progress we're making. But of course, it's got to start with, indeed, energy efficiency, transforming the core, and then looking to invest for growth in more sustainable ways of manufacturing, and then, of course, positioning for those new frontiers. So that's our three-pronged strategy.
Excellent.
Yeah, so at the, you know, the interesting discussion, I don't know if everyone was there at the breakfast, you know, panel discussion this morning, Neil brought up, you know, counting your own sort of scope 1 emissions, developing projects, and then the emissions of the facility over the life cycle of project. And, you know, what we're seeing in renewable fuels, right, the way the renewable fuels incentives work, it's all about the net carbon intensity and getting, you know, reduction in net carbon intensity. And, you know, I grew up in engineering in the offshore business where, weight's really important, right? So the weight manager comes around every week and he's counting everything for the topsize lift. And I see that coming in, the measure of carbon intensity, both in development of the project and in the operating asset. And that's it's in certain markets it's driven by the incentives, but I see it coming in the standards and the requirements and specs for facilities.
Yeah.
Because it's going to matter some in the delivery of the project and the construction of the project, but it's going to matter a whole lot more in the life cycle of the project. And I think we're seeing that in LNG as well, where buyers are, be it their incentives or not, there's discernment in the emissions of the liquefaction facilities, and now there's a lot more focus on the upstream production of the gas, methane emissions on the gas field. So it's starting to be counted, but it hasn't been institutionalized yet in the requirements for the projects.
Good.
So Bob, I want to get a little more granular because I based on what I understand the group's focus is how do you make money, where do you focus on what the customers are going to be, and what are the needs going to be so you can be in the bid and actually win, and then what are the tiebreakers going to be. I'll keep coming back to 3 or 4 things, and then one of the reasons I started Ag Certain Industries is I think there's a fusion right now of a tremendous call in the marketplace, not just for carbon intensity, but for people to understand exactly where what they're getting came from, how it was handled along the way, and whether they're okay with it. And if that person is okay with it, the person might be a company, an individual, based on their budget, they're voting with their dollars. The higher the income per capita or company, the more they vote that way based on their personal view. Therefore, the integrity in the system is a big deal. So at Ag Certain, we're putting in place identity preservation systems and focused on lots of attributes, not just carbon intensity. And once you start tracing something like carbon intensity, and we already see it in business in many attributes around the world, you might have to track, is it made in the US or not? Is it a Jones Act thing? Was somebody improperly used from a labor perspective when they were involved? How do you track that? Well, the more regulation gets in place, the more people are going to tag on to it with whatever their agenda is, right or not. So I think, one, you've got to be lining your businesses up so that you can answer the 10,000 question surveys around, what did you do along the way and how did you get there? And whether you like it or not, I think you're going to have to. It's the easiest thing to regulate in the world. 2, if you want to be anti-competitive internationally, which happens today, the easiest way to do it is around environmental regulation. It happens in agriculture, it happens in biofuels, it happens all over the place, where people will arbitrarily set carbon intensity or other standards at certain levels so that something won't flow into the country so you can protect a particular category of the economy. So you can't just calculate it based on efficiency. You got to pick what it is you're optimizing for. And those businesses who aren't able to sit here and say, I got a 20-year payback because I don't know if what I'm making somebody will care about, not at the molecular level, but at the total intangible level plus physical, you got a whole lot shorter project, which we talked about earlier in some of the panels.
Right.
And efficiency around integrity and verification and efficiency around logistics are almost the most important things in my perspective now around lowering emissions. Because somebody has to believe it and they have to be able to calculate it. And carbon intensity calculations are all about who along the way burned what to make something. And it's hard to validate internationally. The standards are not uniform, and I doubt they ever will be, because it's beneficial to countries that they not be the same. So, third, things are going to be more modular. So you may be an international company with a really cool product, but you got to be able to modularize and sell it in different places, because you're probably not setting up in 3 places and shipping big shiploads. So how do you do that and then ultimately prove it so that when I need to sell my intangible asset to somebody like Microsoft, they know that they don't have what is the biggest issue right now, which is brand safety. Brand safety is a huge issue. So if you're in food or agriculture or anything like that, food safety is table stakes. You don't show up with the right stuff, you're done.
Right.
But if you make a claim, and it ends up being a small percentage of something that a big company is doing, but they put that label on their product or service, and then it turns out to not be real, what do you think is going to happen? It's not just that we had a fractured hydrotreater, it's we had a huge mess and a whole bunch of other stuff. So brand safety is a big, big deal now. Your brand safety, as well as the customers that you're working with, which gets back to intangible value, which is hard to think about when you're building. So I would be thinking about all of that, and the more you can sit here and ensure that those that you're doing business with, at least in front of and after your business in the value chain, and verify that they're behaving the way you want them to, the more likely it is you're going to win.
I agree. I'd like to build off of maybe something I shared yesterday too, to your point.
Yeah.
And that was around, you got to start measuring, right? And this whole concept of this embodied carbon calculator that we talked about, and making sure that we're doing that internally so we know where every single molecule of carbon has come from and where it's going to go, and make sure that we're making good, wise decisions on how we're going to optimize. I like your brand safety concept. We should call it brand sustainability as well.
Yep.
Because when we think about that calculator, we talked about priced options, right? And decisions that we're going to make as corporations on a lot of projects we have. And to me, when we think about safety is a given. Cost and schedule are always talked about, right? Now we're starting to talk about if we're measuring sustainability, that could be a part of the equation that goes into the heuristics of that economic model that says, I'm either going to do that or I'm not going to do it, right? In terms of the project itself. And then more importantly, it's got to be done across the supply chain. So I'm going to hold my customers, my suppliers across the supply chain, and I'm hoping that they're going to hold me accountable as well to making sure that these are considerations that we're going to take very, very seriously and make our corporate decisions on when we put CapEx in front of trying to grow shareholder value, right?
Yeah. Real good point, Jim.
Yeah.
I think the measurements need to be universal as well. And so it's not just that everybody's measuring it, it's that we're all measuring it in the same way, and we have clear indicators as to whether something is aligned with our brand or our policies or what we're trying to achieve. Just in the same way that, nobody would ever hire a contractor with a poor TRIR. We need things that can be consistently measured so that it's easy to interpret and read and discuss.
Yeah. I mean, the investment community, of course, with ESG ratings and stuff are measuring us all on those various performance metrics, without having, I would say, quality data. And therefore, it really is up to everybody, really, to work on improving throughout. This is really a brand safety issue, I would say. Definitely, improving that quality of that information, making sure it's, of course, consistent, and has the breadth that's needed to give the investor the information that they want about. Ultimately, of course, it's about how much risk have I got by investing in your company over the long term, given the energy transition and given, of course, climate change impacts. And so provide the information to them, engage with it, provide the information to them, rather than thinking it's some sort of, decarbonisation, fossil fuel agenda. It's not. It's just asking those questions because of those facts.
So I'll use an example, but I think from I do a fair amount of industrial construction, building facilities on our own, and have probably done a couple dozen over my career, as well as a lot of historic restoration. So scarcity exists today just on a pure commodity basis, depending on what's happening with global supply chains. Well, let's start talking about scarcity now in terms of attribute of material. So it's exactly the same I-beam, it's exactly the same whatever it is that you're getting, but if it doesn't have a code that says it has a certain amount of carbon intensity, or it has a certain amount of where it was made in the world, because we do or don't believe their certifications, you can find that you are stocked out even though you've got a yard full of the stuff that you want to have. So in the business I'm in right now, we're practicing in learning how to do things in bulk with liquid and grain, which is a literally continuous flow, hard to isolate, hard to create lots as you're working through, and everything is getting smaller. So we have to, instead of huge tanks, we've got to have smaller tanks. We've got to have dozens of tanks. We can sit here and isolate, batch, and do it. And the integrity in the overall system around special attributes that we look at. So use these as proxies. So sometimes it's organic, sometimes it's non-GMO, sometimes it's kosher, sometimes it's halal. Well, the world may or may not think that matters. And I know from my own experience in biofuels, you can be in a place in a world where they think it's crazy that we would all pay a higher price for something, and they will just sign whatever the piece of paper is to make it okay, because they're just trying to eat. So you have a verification cost to go in that adds a huge amount of margin. And we have stuff that goes through our business from Eastern Europe to Iowa and then back overseas just because of verification. So when you think about that, and we're getting it in containers of plastic bags full of stuff, Fluxy containers and otherwise, start taking that to commodities and start taking that to construction materials, and think about how hard it is even to know if you have the right metal today, and now add to that, is it the right metal from the right place with the right paper? And we're not even talking about aircraft assembly part verification. We're talking about a whole bunch of other stuff. So you might have tankers of oil. It could be the same thing with steel. Mm-hmm. How do you verify it? You can't just go scan it and know what was right. That's going to be a lot of cost. Mm. The other thing that I see happening is local rebuild, repair. That starts to matter in the way you calculate. Are you engineering for stuff that can be rebuilt and repaired? You know, all of this stuff is contrary to large scale. Take it to mean time between failure rate, get rid of it, keep going. So smaller, not small, is new. And coming back, and everything's going to get smaller because you're not going to be able to trace everything without being a little bit smaller. Mm.
It's going to be interesting. Imagine on GCGV, if all those massive modules that came over all had to have significant verifiable carbon counting statements attached to every component in there.
Sourced from around the world.
Mm. Yeah.
But I mean, of course, blockchain, right? Yeah, the ultimate. So I think, you know, I think technology ultimately is the solution to everything. I really do. I would say that. But I mean, there is a solution there with blockchain. You know, there's work going, companies starting up to, of course, look at blockchain in products. Fuels, yes, that's happening today. Gas, natural gas. And of course, then it's going to come in the steel that we buy and the concrete that we buy, and of course, various options to decarbonize those supply chains as well. So, yeah, the data ultimately, we need to, of course, get back to the data and everybody having a way to share the data to have the traceability.
So I agree and I don't.
Okay.
Blockchain is an easy thing to say. It's crazy hard to do when you have a lot of human verification that's occurring.
Yeah.
So at what point along the way do we have a universal standard that says, here's what right looks like in Malaysia, here's what right looks like in South Korea, here's what right looks like in Cleveland. Then we can sign off on it on the paper that says, all right, blockchain's assembled at this stage, move forward, move forward, move forward. You end up in a really interesting world where it's almost like you have a cupboard. So to build a building, you got a cupboard of supplies all the way around the world. They have all these attributes, and you say, I want this kind of building. And then we try to look at the supply chain and say, well, I have 2 buildings or 100. Yeah. How do I then get that from all these weird spots to the right place to get it built to meet a LEED or whatever the new LEED standard is to get that done? Yeah. The costs are going to be crazy. And mostly North America and Europe are going to pay it. Because we can.
So I would say ISO process is working on those things, and various regional standards organizations are working on those solutions to provide regional standards then adopted internationally to do those exact things.
I just want to give you an example, and I know this is ag, but there's a company I'm interacting with who has a particular kind of product that you probably drink every 2 weeks. And where they source it, it gets sold by small producers, and they have to go out and field certify 200 variables by every one of these small producers to then aggregate it, get it together into bags, get it together into connexes, get it onto a ship, move it over here, and never lose the identity with any of that lot or traceability. Anytime you're moving into something that can feel like it's fluid, whether it's physical or not, blockchain is not going to work very well. And most of the world's that way. So you got to start tracking insulation. You've got to start tracking stuff that you're blowing and moving, things that are coming by large, full trucks. So I agree, but it's back to timeline. I don't think they're going to want to wait. And I think it's a long time until somebody has a blockchain worked out that works. So we're seeing everything decommoditize, and then to your point, we're going to recommoditize. There'll probably be 2 or 3 of everything that end up becoming acceptable because they work in blockchain. But how long does that take?
It's going to take a while.
It's going to take a while.
It takes a while, but the good news is we're getting started. Right? So we'll think about OS2. Right? And we're starting to put these communities and neighborhoods together, right? Blockchain being one of them. How do we start lifting some of these challenges up so that we can have something really tangible to really work on? Hey, this is not going to go away. Well, I mean, I think there's practical solutions. We got to get started. We got to get the right research going, the right technology developed. We have to have the difficult debate. And then let's move forward and make that something that CII and CURT can also kind of work on, right, together, because it's already getting started on the things that we see in the vision and what it's going to take to be able to deliver successful projects into the future.
And wouldn't it be nice if we're proactive instead of waiting around for state and federal EPA policy or other things to tell us what it's going to be?
Well, you can shape import rules, you can shape what the standards are for things coming in.
Right.
So a couple of years, well, no, more than that, many years ago, some engineers in our turbine division built their own LCA tool. And now we're using that LCA tool on drill bits. And of course, then that makes us understand the full supply chain logistics, the original feed material costs, etc., and then of course then how it's used in the field. And we're able to then break down and say, well, actually, let's go additive manufacturing. What impact will that have on improving the life cycle emissions? You can completely remap your viewpoint of your historical business and make it lower cost, more efficient, and have a product for the customer that is actually a lot better. I mean, there's examples like that all over the place we're finding.
Well, let me switch topics a little bit and go in another direction. A lot of you know that leadership in Houston recently announced a pretty significant goal of potentially becoming the Gulf Coast, and at least everything from Baton Rouge to Corpus, being the largest single global carbon capture, carbon sequestration center on Earth. Nigel, that's a pretty damn big statement. Is that going to happen? And if so, what are going to be the things that are going to have to do it to make this thing work?
So indeed, we have everything, I think, in Houston that is needed to make it happen. Physically, of course, we have various industries, various types of emissions, some flue gas-based, but also process emissions in the refineries and petchem plants themselves, and of course some cement and steel. And there's, of course, a whole wide range of cost of capture. And so starting with the low-hanging fruit and then building out the rest of the infrastructure that's needed to get to the ultimate scale that's out there, ultimately massive investment, massive volumes of CO2 mitigation that go along with that. You've got to build a vision and then a plan to achieve it, but start with the lowest hanging fruit. Things where current policies, tax credits, production tax credit, 45Q, can nearly just about reach. And what additions would be required on top of that. If we're going to build a pipeline, of course, that can accommodate all of the volume for all of the facilities, ultimately, let's pre-invest in that. What would that take? So yeah, you've got to have a vision. You've got to design it. You've got to then understand what is needed at various points and how you would expand it. But the geology is there, the emissions are there, the sources are there, of course, and it can achieve very, very large-scale emissions reductions. And if you look at it versus the investments that have been made over time in wind and solar, it's comparable. It really is truly comparable. So, and yeah, of course, it just gets to different parts of the sectors.
Well, wind and solar, some of that was, what, 18, almost 19 years ago?
A lot, yeah, decades.
So it took a while, right? So
yeah.
You're saying that I probably shouldn't put any capital project quotas into our next year's budget tied to this?
Everything's accelerating. That's all I'm going to say. Everything is accelerating, definitely last year, this year still, of course. And so there's a lot going on. And with that, more and more people are engaging. It's not just operators, it's finance as well. Different collaborations and partnerships are coming together. And from that, there will be innovation, not just technological, but business models. I would definitely expect actual action. And that's the thing, we have to drive things quicker.
Yeah.
Things have got to happen quicker now than they have done before. Let's look at the past, what happened, wind and solar, very modular technologies that are scalable. Let's use that model. If that works to get, cost reduction through quickly, then let's go with it.
Great.
Yes, one that, I think it's going to require a lot of collaboration, right? Because there's going to have to be shared facilities. There needs to be some legislation changes in the state of Texas to support the sequestration reservoirs and the liability associated with that. And then we need to solve the technical challenges on the actual carbon capture piece, right? There are various technologies, but they're going to have to be retrofitted in the facilities to capture it and then aggregate it in the pipeline or wherever it's going to go. And I think we need to start, as an industry, we need to start coming up with smart solutions for drop-in, scalable facilities that can go into brownfield operating facilities without major interruption and can do it with reliable technology.
Yeah. That's why I like the direct air capture area. And that may seem really weird. Why would somebody that wants low-cost carbon capture to go at scale on industrial sources of emissions be interested in direct air capture? It's because they're starting, independent of the facilities, on technologies that have to be energy efficient and cost effective. And those base technology types are fundamentally different to what we have in carbon capture today in traditional systems, amine-based absorption. They're looking at physical materials and advanced materials in order to do it, both sorbent and membrane-based systems. And
I think those technologies have further to go than concentrated streams extraction.
They do, and I think they don't, but we just need to get some plants out there and prove it. I could have opinion, lots of people have opinions, but let's do small-scale projects and go find out.
Pilot them.
Yeah, and the other thing about that, I think that not all sectors of the energy industry are going to move at the same speed, right? There's different incentives and different drivers driving each of them, be it power, be it moving gray ammonia towards blue ammonia, be it renewable fuels aspect or just chasing 45Q. So it's not everybody's rushing at the same speed and the same time for the same reasons. There's going to be pockets of the market that will lead, and then everyone else will follow along.
Yep. 45Q is $50 a ton for pure storage right now. If you capture emissions, there's legislation in place that's talking about upgrading it to $85 a ton. And there's legislation there as well that's talking about direct air capture providing $120, $150 per ton of CO2 captured. And probably you're thinking, wow, that's a lot of money. the same and higher levels have already gone into renewable fuels and wind and solar historically. $200, $250 a ton if you back calculate what the CO2 saving cost is. And that's why these new technologies, we've got to get them into marketplace. We've got to test them out, find on-ramps for them, and just get it done and get the cost down. That's what's happened elsewhere. Yeah. Do it together.
Yes, Dan.
So what I see occur is, look, I'm on the industrial operator side as opposed to some of the other things we're hearing. What I generally see in the scale I operate at is about 1/10. I think we're going to not have a lot of huge projects anymore. They're generally going to be something in the, and I'm swagging, but generally 1/10 size, which has a material effect on how you think about how you go to market and operate. Mm-hmm. So the forgiveness in the budget is different if you're on the short end of cost and you got to eat it based on whatever the contract is you're doing. The skill of the operators who are doing project management has to be a lot tighter if you're on smaller projects. They're still big. They still have a lot of technology risk. So maybe it's $50 million to $100 million instead of $750 to $1 billion project, as an example. And retrofit's a big deal, but I think about it as a continuous improvement, ROIC sort of thing. And it's ROIC calculated in a version of carbon intensity or just another version of pollution. So people are going to get into this as it's economically prudent, but they have to start doing something. So a little bit all the time works a whole lot better than waiting for perfect and then trying to do it, because waiting for perfect is unlikely to happen. So retrofit, to your point, smaller trials, figuring out what the right machines are. But the ROIC is based on the local supply and demand of whatever it is the reduction is that people are seeking. And to the extent that you see 50 different ways coming at each other doing it, you don't have to be in the same industry to reduce your carbon intensity. Some, like in Houston, are more likely to get a lot at the same time. But my guess is they're indifferent. They don't care where the carbon intensity reduction comes from. So betting too much on one technology, hard to do. It'll make it harder for people to go big. And when they go big, it's going to be just a few. So thinking about how you scale your business, how you think about your flexibility in your contracting, how you think about your brand safety, I think that's a practical outcome because the carbon intensity does not have to come from chemicals or energy. I mean, it can come from all over the place. It's just wherever people are calculating it.
Exactly. Yeah. I see all of the low carbon energy area really, it's the marginal producer right now, right? And the way the business model for marginal production is to indeed have small, modular, scalable answers that can get you a foothold in the marketplace, be it regionally or sector-wise, et cetera. So, no, I think that's a really, really good point, man.
And I know I sound a little realistic maybe, but I think there's a great business here. This is what Ag-Certain Industries is focused on: traceability, identification, making sure that we're getting exactly the right thing, creating the same level of quality of production, but at a smaller footprint, so top 100 companies can take our ingredients or products and not worry about it. The same thing here. We just have to adjust to whatever that new scale is going to be.
I mean, it's happened in oil and gas, of course, with shale.
Right.
I mean, that's the marginal producer, and it's modular, scalable business. And that's why actually the oil and gas industry has loved it.
It's been great.
So it's not a challenge we haven't risen to before.
Yeah.
Great.
Right? So if the economics work, we get the efficiency, drive the cost down on those types of facilities.
Yep.
But it's just important to remember the product of carbon intensity reduction is not held by any industry. So these ideas are competing everywhere.
Truly universal.
Yeah, so hard to bet big.
So Dan, you come from an agribusiness background, but also obviously chemicals. But and then Jim, you come from predominantly a hydrocarbon oil and gas background. Is there differences in the way these cultures work together and think about business and projects?
Yes.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Was that a loaded question?
Not in a negative way.
So elaborate on
let's
that.
let him go first.
Well, I think there's an opportunity. I mean, when I worked for DuPont, we had different market segments in there, right? We had the energy side of it, right? We had the petchem side of it, and we had the ag business.
Yeah.
The key was to how you leverage, some of the synergies across those businesses and drive them together. So it's all about, again, the collaboration. Are we collaborating together between petchem and the ag segment in general? No. I don't feel it. Maybe you feel it, but I don't feel it. But is there an opportunity? I do believe there's an opportunity because it's going to take all segments to come together and address this. I think we all have been saying the same thing. It's not just about, Microsoft being able to reduce it. I'm kind of agnostic to where my carbon reductions come from, but I do want to partner across the supply chain broadly and across different market segments because I know there's some really good ideas that are going to be out there that I'm going to be able to take and make advantage of, right, to drive, again, the shareholder value.
So for carbon emission reduction strategy, the electric vehicle obviously is a popular option. And so do you think that the regular engine that's in my Suburban is going to just go away?
Yeah, that's why I don't drive with you anymore.
Renewable fuels versus the EV.
Well, I'm a diesel fan. I spent my time in biomass-based diesel, so I think that's never going away. Not just because I was there, but like if you're in a place like North America, you have to have no less than a hybrid. But for the power, for the density, the torque, you got to have a diesel engine. You're going to have that for a long time. It's 30 years if it's anything. It doesn't mean that in a local route area you wouldn't have some electrical stuff going on, but for real work, I think we're going to have a diesel engine for a long time and probably a hybrid. And from a carbon and mileage perspective, diesel hybrids are great when you think about what you can do with them. And back to your question about working together. So I've worked in renewable diesel, biodiesel, pharmaceuticals, biotech, straight up ag. So kind of fusion of all these things, was involved in the acquisition of Centrolium and the hydrotreating operation, other activities down in Geismar. So I did that deal. I think it's important to remember that whether it's petroleum or ag, it's just dead plants and animals. Is it 50 million years ago or is it recently? And that might sound callous, but when you think about the carbon, that's what it is. So on the plant and animal side, it's the photosynthesis process that's recycling that carbon, coming back in through a plant into an animal or directly into a plant, and you're using it. So it's a very virtuous cycle that, it's economics that make it different. So now it's not okay to suck lots of oil out of the ground. The price for everything else is higher, but it's still food first. So I think the biggest difference is scale. So I generally operate truckloads and rail cars at a time. And that world likes to operate in unit trains and shiploads at a time. But if you get back to regional and other activities, everything's going to get smaller in the traditional conventional world. And I think anything renewable will be ever more competitive for all these things we've been talking about. So once you get to processing, it's just scale. This stuff is pretty similar.
Good outreach.
Yeah. So this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'd love to just keep listening to it. But we've received literally over 50 questions from the audience. So and we've just got about 8 or so minutes left. Yeah. So I'm wondering if we could ask some of the audience questions. And the first question really has to do with, have we reached the point of no return? It seems we're maybe even too late in the carbon capture implementation. Can we ever recover and reverse the global warming trend? So we've been all talking about as if like we can do it. Is it even realistic is, I guess, the question.
So let me start off with saying carbon capture technologies are available today and are scalable and work ultimately. There's basically just a price on that, but there's also, of course, juxtaposition to that, a value for it, and the value of it really isn't well understood, I would say. it's becoming much, much better understood. But it's all about acceleration. Yes, acceleration is needed. And that will come from big infrastructure investments. And yes, we do have that in the new infrastructure bill here in the US. Also, I saw today that there was $8 billion for hydrogen projects for regional hydrogen hubs. So yeah, those things will now come at scale for us to incorporate and achieve. But there's, of course, multiple things. But I would say with carbon capture, it's dear to my heart, worked on it for a long time. There's no net zero without carbon capture. It's fundamentally important to achieve net zero through negative emissions technologies such as bioenergy with CCS. Dan and I, we're going to have to talk, and of course, direct air capture.
Okay. Why do we continue to talk about cost when we're fighting for our future generations? So I'm familiar with some countries in Europe, and there's a conversation that goes almost like, it doesn't matter even what it costs, we have to do it. So this is the reverse idea of the first question. Why do we even worry about cost? It's like, we've got to solve this or there's just no planet, and why are we so hung up on costs? The next set of questions is all about incentives, but let's try this one first.
So I think that we're all thinking about this as though we are on a burning platform. And I think really, though, we're acting as though the platform's just kind of smoldering. I think that's where the hang up on cost happens. I think when the platform really is on fire, you get past those barriers. PG&E had been putting off some kind of major improvements in California, mostly with undergrounding a lot of their wires. And they just recently committed $30 billion to do that. And they're literally on fire. But it took that for that change to happen. They went along spending about $3 billion a year on maintaining that system, making some minor improvements, investing in decarbonization. But eventually, the platform really did catch fire, and they found the money that they thought was impossible.
Great example.
Yeah, good example.
I'll give you another example on that is clean growth. So the UK has its strategies around clean growth. So what does that actually mean? That means investment and jobs. If you look at, I was saying to Bob yesterday, if you look at the European hydrogen strategy, for every $1 billion that's spent on electrolyzer, it's $10 billion that has to be spent on renewable power to supply it. And for every billion, there's 10,000 jobs. So I mean, there's the value proposition.
Yeah.
It's solving multiple problems. So how do you keep free market principles in play for lower carbon strategies? Often the conversation moves to highly regulated and forced government involvement and subsidies. So is there and I know there's ESG criteria, right, as an investment criteria, but I think at this point it's estimated to be sort of 3 to 4 or 5% of the world's investor populations. That's probably growing. It's probably a demographic trend. But in the meantime, are we going to have government intervention to get there?
Yes, I'll say yes. I mean, you've got to get these technologies till they're mature enough to be operating at scale and efficiently. It does take targeted intervention and subsidies in the market. They shouldn't be perennial. They should, adjust and adapt over time. But it's the stimulus that's needed, and that's why we're seeing different sectors, the market moving at different speeds, because the incentive is there, or the incentive is not quite there, or there's no incentive. So I think it's U.S. is a free capitalist society, and it does need that nudge, because these are societal problems. Yeah. It needs the governmental nudge with those subsidies to get the results. But ultimately, the technologies will get there, and they will be cost effective and competitive.
So the only thing I would say on that, rather than subsidy, is probably a better word is incentive.
Yeah. Incentives.
Because subsidy can, really tend to be, not really drive competitive.
Right.
Improvements and cost reduction, performance enhancement. So yeah, I would say incentives that take those considerations in.
So Jim's shaking his head.
I have a very different opinion on all of this.
Okay, please.
I think if we wait for the government for incentives, we're in trouble. we've really got to get started. I shared yesterday that clearly we're in a position now in Microsoft where we've started our own funding, right, internally. Corporations have got to step up to the plate if they want to be in business moving forward. The government's going to provide some of the incentives, I agree, for some of the technology development, but if we don't get started and we wait on the government, good luck, right? I'm not going to wait in the government, my organization, to get going. And that's, the $15 per metric ton of carbon that's getting funded out of every business in my company and every function, and the $1 billion contribution from the CEO to say, okay, here's the projects we're going to fund. Every company needs to kind of start to think about, what's their position going to be on that, because the government's not going to come to our rescue.
Yeah, I think the government is a awfully tough place to solve hard problems because it is encumbered by too many rules of society that keep any quick decision from ever happening anytime on any subject. So I do think we're at a tipping point. Optimistically, we need to make it easier to do business with companies who care about these things. And consumers do care. And those two things together create an opportunity to make some money. And we have to just make it easier all the time. Now, where I think the government could be useful, having lived through this for 20 years on the biofuel side, is not trying to play with it every year. Like, so if they're going to put something in, make it a constant standard that we are all engineering around and towards so that we're competing for whatever the margin is. And that, from a cost perspective or an investment perspective, will make better decision-making occur. When we get away from good decision-making with capital, that's a very hard place to be because it feels frivolous and fickle, and then nobody wants to play. So if we can have an even period for a long period, 10 years is not enough when you're building the stuff we do. So you got to have at least 20 years. Put a clear goal, don't be fickle, and don't mess with it. The other thing is help with the international recognition of how you count carbon. Those are two things that I think matter. And the government might be useful in that, and we're not diplomats, so maybe they can do it. But it's not simple to calculate carbon because somebody's waste is somebody else's carbon credit. And who gets to count the waste? And who gets to count the reuse of that? That alone makes it very hard.
Yeah, there was a question actually along those lines about, is a watchdog needed? And if so, how does that even get adjudicated?
I think the watchdog will be brand safety. Companies will crush companies who screw them up.
Yeah.
They just will.
Yeah, I mean, so the SEC, of course, working on ESG documentation and submissions right now. So, of course, there's discussions going on. So, in the US, fiduciary responsibilities, we'll see what happens there. Great.
Well, I know we're basically out of time, and there's just so many questions here that didn't get answered, and apologies that we couldn't answer all of them, but maybe we can try to get answers to some of these, maybe through email and post them back on the conference app site or something like that. But really want to, Bob, thank you for coordinating the panel. Panelists, thank you guys for participating. It's been really insightful and informative, and appreciate your contributions. Give them a round of applause, please. Okay. So our Carroll H. Dunn Award of Excellence is going to be given to Wayne Crew at the National Academy of Construction. Just a few words first before I bring Wayne up. The Carroll Dunn Award, Award of Excellence, was established by CII in 1985 to honor an individual for significant achievements to improving the engineering and construction industry. And that's our Institute's highest honor, and it's recognized as one of the most prestigious awards in the industry. And so it's my personal honor to present the Carroll Dunn Award to Wayne Crew, one of my professional mentors. Wayne is the past director of CII. He currently serves, as I said, as the General Secretary of the National Academy of Construction, and he's been doing that since the end of 2015. Prior to leading CII for 9 years, he actually worked at CII as the Associate Director in Research, and before that, when he was in industry, he was very active on the Board of Advisors and in the research area on several different research teams and the Research Committee. His career in industry, before he came to CII, he was the Vice President of Construction at Technip in Houston, and before that, 23 years at KBR and its predecessor companies, Kellogg Brown & Root and Brown & Root. He began his career at Amoco after graduating with a degree in engineering at Michigan State. And along the way, he was also one of the first graduates of the executive MBA program at the University of Houston. Wayne embodies, I can tell you, he embodies every attribute of a Carroll Dunn awardee. He's made really significant contributions to the industry, and he continues to do that today. He believes that the work we do in engineering and construction positively transforms our society, our people, companies, in a way that no other industry really can. Early in his career, he witnessed a fatality directly on a construction site, and this is a story that impacted me deeply, but he recounted this at a Board of Advisors meeting for CII a few years ago. And I think over the past 4 decades, this experience really, really deeply impacted him. And I think it compelled him to do absolutely everything he could each and every day, whether he was in industry or at CII or now at the National Academy of Construction, to really help this industry improve, especially in the area of safety. And so as part of NAC, he recently had an effort to reform some policies around crane safety after a significant incident in New York City. And that's just one small example of Wayne's dedication to improving our business. He's also the only director other than Richard Tucker to receive the Carroll Dunn Award. And he was unanimously selected by the CII Executive Committee because of the level of his involvement in so many forums over so many years. He's been a leader at both the local and the national levels in the ACE Mentor program. And if you're not familiar with that, I'd encourage you to look that up and also get involved, because this is really helping bring the next generation of professionals into architecture, engineering, and construction. I would say that he'll probably never know the extent to which he's positively impacted so many people in the industry and even in this room. I'm personally indebted to Wayne for his patience and guidance and support of me. As I mentioned, he's really probably my main mentor. And I'd also say we're all works in progress. I mean, this is part of it. One of the things, as being the director now for 6 years, I can tell you I often think about how Wayne would have handled a particular situation or opportunity. But that's really probably the greatest legacy that anybody can leave. Is to inspire the next generation of folks to reach even higher. So Wayne is here today with his wife, Ravanna. I thought I just saw her. Oh, there you are. Hi, Ravanna. They reside near Waco, Texas, and they're very active in their community and in their church and with their grandchildren who live nearby. So please join me in congratulating Wayne on this well-deserved award. Congratulations. Appreciate you.
Good afternoon. It's been a while since I've been here at a CII meeting, and I have to say it's good to be back. Good to see you all. I appreciate it. Stephen called me and said, we're going to give you the Carroll H. Dunn Award. Can you come to Orlando? And I was stunned. In fact, I still have those pinchable moments when you can't believe that it's actually, you were told that. And I think the reason I'm stunned more than anything is because I know lots of the past Carroll H. Dunn Award winners, right? John Dalton, Melissa Hurt, go back further, Jan Tuckman, J.J. Suarez, go back even further, and Dave Nash, go back further, Richard Tucker. These people are giants and legends, and I know their character, and I know their contributions and their accomplishments, and so to be considered to be in the same roster of names as they are is just an honor that I haven't figured out how to put into words yet. So Stephen, thank you, and Doug, wherever you are, thanks the executive committee. I just, again, I can't describe the honor it is. I also want to say thank you to Steve Cabano and Carl Haas, in particular the awardees for this year. Being on the same platform as them, being on the same award platform as them, just kind of elevates everything for me. I've watched them for 20 years, and they're incredible. Lots of thank yous. First, again, to CII, your executive committee, and to you all here. Thank you to all the mentors. Steve mentioned mentors, but people that have had patience with me and taught me and guided me. I can think of names like Jim Seaman, Lou Grasty. All those people come flooding back in your memory when something like this happens, and without them, I wouldn't be standing up here. Thank you to my family. I've got kids, and of course, we all want to be great examples and testaments to our kids, and set that example for them to look at, and for our grandkids too. So they aren't with us. Paige and Matthew and Emily, our daughter-in-law, aren't with us. Our grandkids aren't with us, although I wish they were. We'd probably be over at Disney World instead of being here if they were. So, but I love them, thank them, and they're kind of my motivation for doing this. The biggest thank you of all, of course, goes to my wife, Ravanna. I don't think she knew what she was getting into almost 50 years ago, but she's been by my side. She's been my cheerleader. She's been my affirmer. Things go bad, she's picking me up, and she also keeps me down when I need that. And so I love you. Thank you so much, babe. I got a minute and 36 seconds, according to the timer, to say what I got to say, and I've got the microphone, so I get to say it. We face the biggest challenge in our industry I think we've ever faced before. If you go back and look at the 2014 annual conference, and the videos are on the website, look for the presentation of David Foote, and he starts talking about the demographics of our country and what that means. And if you look at today's birth rate is the lowest it's been. The number of births have been declining. They've declined 20% over the last 12 years here. So we've always talked before, and I always had shortages before. We're short of welders or we're whatever, right? But I'm telling you, we're going to face a time here when there's more people leaving the workforce, not just our industry because we're dirty and smelly and all of that, but there's more people going to leave the workforce than there's going to be entering the workforce. In face of that demographic trend, we also have the opportunity to double the built environment in the next 12 or 15 years, right? So we're going to look around you, we're going to double everything you see, and it's going to move because all the people are moving around, and yet we're faced with not having the workforce that we've had forever and ever and ever. What tools are we going to use to do that? And as I was thinking about that, I think there's a couple of tools. Number one is technology. Of course, you thought I was going to say that, right? Technology, technology, technology. There's some really cool things exploding in our universe today. If you get a hold of Oracle and ask them to send you their construction challenge in a box, they will send you a Lego kit, and you will build that, or in my case, my granddaughter built it because she wouldn't let me touch the Legos. And then you get done and they send you instructions and you take pictures and you send it to them and they run it through their artificial intelligence software. And now you can get on a Zoom with them and you can talk about artificial intelligence and how to apply it here in our industry. So one example of technology that's going crazy. I really encourage you to do that. So get a hold of your friends at Oracle, ask them to get a hold of Jeff and have them send you the construction in a box challenge. So technology, but how are you going to use that technology? So the next tool I think we have is CII-CURT, PIP, right? So everybody that's here, what we've been doing for the last 40 years now, right, is is learning how to use these new things, learning how people use these new things, and learning the best practices and methods to use those things, and growing that and continuously improving that. And I think the last, so I'm kind of simple-minded when it comes to these things, so I think success is equal to the technology plus CII, and the last thing I would say, so we get three components to this equation, is you and your leadership, right? So what I want you to do is go back to your companies. I want you to double, triple your involvement with CII and CURT and PIP. I want you to embrace the technologies. I want you to really lead this effort, because when you do that, I don't have any doubt that 15 or 20 years from now, this built environment is going to be better. It's going to be built safer, more cost-effective, on time than it's ever been done before, and you guys are going to come up to the challenge. So with that, I think I ran out of words. So I want to say thank you one more time. God bless you, and have safe travels home.
That's what it looks like now. We can mail it to you. I didn't know I was supposed to work it. Well, Wayne, congratulations. We're really happy to award this to you. And that actually takes us to a break until 3:40, so we'll look forward to having everybody back then for our final keynote.